Non-Monogamy Help is a podcast where your questions about open, non-monogamous or polyamorous relationships are answered. Our host, Lola Phoenix, will consult a licensed therapist with over a decade of experience to address your problems. Names and locations have been changed or censored to keep your questions anonymous. You're listening to Non-Monogamy Help, the podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 62 of the Non-Monogamy Help podcast. I'm Lola Phoenix. Please send your questions to nonmonogamyhelp@gmail.com and they'll either be read in the podcast or the column anonymously, depending on what you would like. If you would like to read the columns, you can go to nonmonogamyhelp.com, subscribe to the newsletter by going to go.nonmonogamyhelp.com/email, and follow us on Twitter @nonmonogamyhelp. If you want to support the columns and the podcast, please consider becoming a patron. Even $1 a month helps support the daily running of the columns and podcasts, and it just shows me a general vote of support, which I really appreciate. And you can do that by going to patreon.com/Lola Phoenix. And if you donate $5 or more a month, your name, with your permission, of course, will be read at the end of the podcast. All right, let's get to this week's discussion question. If this is the first time you're hearing this, every week before I read the letter, I put forth a discussion question that you can use with your friends, partners, Metamours, anyone that you would like to get to know a little bit better. I also answer it myself briefly to give you a little bit of context. So this week's discussion question is, how many of your friends know each other? And I picked this discussion question, and I think that it's interesting because I think that sometimes people have issues in polyamory and non-monogamy when their friendship groups are all kind of the same, and they don't have, if they're looking at their dating pool, that is kind of like where they're pulling people into a dating pool. Not that friends have to necessarily be people that you can't date or whatever, but I think that it's an interesting question to ask someone to see if you have like different groups of friends that do know each other, don't know each other. I would say that I do have definitely different friendship groups that do know each other and some that don't. I personally prefer that because I think that, I just would prefer if not everyone knew each other all the time. I don't know why. I just would prefer it. That's how I prefer things. So let me repeat the discussion question again. How many of your friends know each other? All right, let's get to this week's letter. I'm a married polyamorous woman, and I have been dating a man for almost 2 years. Our relationship has always been moderately long distance, as we live just over an hour apart across an international border. But since COVID, that border is now mostly closed, and we see each other much less. He has been married to his primary partner for 6 years, and they've been polyamorous about half that long, each having had various shorter-term partnerships. He just with women, her with women and men. Let's call my partner Sean and his primary partner Leah. Leah has been in a relationship with another partner, let's say Sam, for about a year and a half. They have a lot of shared interests and activities that Sean doesn't like, so they spend several days and nights a week together. Sam is solo polyam and from the beginning has been awful at acknowledging and respecting Leah and Sean's boundaries. It doesn't help that Sean and Sam have very different interests and personalities, so they've never bonded as Metamours. Sam also has burned bridges with Leah and Sean's friends by being confrontational and aloof at gatherings, so they aren't interested in spending time with him either. Despite Sean's boundary that he does not want to spend time with Sam, either separately or with Leah, Sam continuously pushes to visit Sean and Leah's home without warning, store things in their space, and be invited to their social gatherings. He has been or underemployed for the length of his relationship with Leah, and she pays part of his rent and for most of their date nights and agrees to drive him to places because he doesn't have a car. Sam has had a variety of short, dramatic relationships with younger women throughout their partnership, and nights out with Leah and other partners has ended in screaming fights, and sometimes with the other woman partner or Leah literally out on the street on their own, intoxicated because he has stormed off or locked them out. Despite this, he is always successful in guilting Leah into continuing to date him and to spend more and more time with him. He has also managed to imply that he isn't the problem, but instead that Sean is too controlling and should let Sam come to their home and to their social gatherings whenever Sam wants. This has been incredibly toxic and upsetting both to Sean and to me. Leah is a very smart woman, a feminist, and yet she continues to be dragged through drama after drama with Sam. Not only is she not broken up with him, but whenever they have a disagreement, she's only worried that he will break up with her, and always eagerly resumes their relationship after days of him freezing her out. It's the latest development that worries me the most, and he has taken this from toxic to potentially abusive. Leia has recently met and gone on a few dates with another married polyam woman, let's call her Susan, who was very stable and pleasant. Susan got along well with Sean and Leia's friends, and Sean found her to be a lovely person to spend time with. But the first time Leia invited Susan and a couple of Susan's female friends to hang out with Sam, Sam accused Susan of yelling at him just for trying to get to know her friend better, which sounds to Sean like he made an unwanted move on a friend, and Susan told him to back off. Sam got so angry that he refused to speak with Leia for days over this, which was only made worse when Leia and Sean hosted a very small COVID-friendly gathering at their home this weekend, to which Sam was not invited. He has now made Leia so guilty that she's been upset and crying for 2 days, and the worst part is, Sean tells me, Leia has now called things off with Susan entirely. We are at a total loss. Sam is succeeding in alienating Leia from her friends and other healthy partners, and Leia will not listen to Sean's concerns. I've felt just terrible over this all day. Sean is stuck with this toxic person in his life, is worried sick about Leia, and I can't be with him for support. Is there anything we can do? Do you have any recommendations for resources that may help Leia more objectively, and not through the lens of Sean's dislike for Sam, see that Sam's behavior is hurtful and full of red flags? Sean has asked me not to contact Leia at all about this, and I will respect his request, but I'm hurting for both of these people that I care for. Any advice would be appreciated. Thanks. Before we get to this week's answer, I'm going to quickly plug this episode's sponsor, BetterHelp. Quite often in a lot of my columns and podcasts, I encourage people to seek a polyamory-friendly therapist. For a lot of people looking locally for a therapist, and especially during these times, who might be supportive of polyamory, can be impossible or out of their budget. BetterHelp allows you to find therapists online that you can send message to at any time of day, and it does offer some financial aid for people who can't usually afford therapy. You can get 10% off your first month by using the promo code Non-Monogamy Help even, or going to betterhelp.com/non-monogamy help. Let's get to this week's answer. The long and short of this, unfortunately, is that there is very, very, very little that you can actually do. The issue with this is that it sounds more than toxic, especially if he's starting to basically try to alienate her slowly from all of her relationships. That does sound abusive, and it does sound unfortunate and very, very difficult for everyone around. Basically, the gist of the situation is that the second that you, as a person involved in this person's life, began to demand them to leave people, or demand that they stop seeing people, and I'm not saying that's what you would do, but anything that seems that way can easily be twisted and turned by the person who is abusing them. Exactly as you said, that he says now that Sean is too controlling. So it's going to be very, very difficult for you or Sean to really do anything about this situation. There is a really good book called Why Does He Do That by Lindy Bancroft. I recommend it all the time because it was really, really helpful for me. It's just a really good breakdown of what goes through the mind of people who are abusive, and the narratives that we're kind of given in society is that people do this and they can't help themselves, and that it's not something that they are consciously doing. But a lot of what Lindy Bancroft shows in his book is that it is very conscious. If you can get her to read that, that'd be amazing. However, it is going to be something that is incredibly difficult for you to do, because I'm pretty sure he's going to be furious about her reading that. There is another website that I also recommend called youarenotcrazy.com, and it talks about verbal abuse specifically, and how people can who are verbally abusive can twist things. So that might be something that she wants to look at. I would just be careful. I would read Why Does He Do That before you suggest anything to her, and just be careful about the way that you go about it, because basically what she just needs is for somebody to be there for her and not abandon her. So against all odds, don't just abandon her to Sam's whims, basically, because that's what he's hoping that you'll do. And it's so much easier for someone who is abusive to continue abusing someone whilst they are isolated from everybody that they know. The other thing that you can do, in that Sean can do, is he is absolutely able to set firm boundaries in the shared spaces he has with Leia. And it does sound like he's kind of doing that. They have gatherings without Sam being invited, but that obviously causes a lot of stress. But I wouldn't encourage him to ease up on those boundaries. I would encourage him to keep them. I would encourage him to be more firm in them. The thing about it is that I don't think that Leia is going to be willing to execute those boundaries fully. As you've said throughout the letter, that every time he kind of says jump, she says how high. But I mean, the thing is, I think that Sean can just allow himself to be characterized that way by Sam. And for the sake of his own sanity, put down those boundaries and say, like, look, I don't want you at my house, and I'm allowed to because it's my shared space. I don't want you to keep your stuff here, you know, and it's going to put more pressure on the situation, undoubtedly, but it's really, really important for him to maintain that, because if he starts just letting things happen, it's not going to make the situation any better. Like, as much as you might think, oh, okay, well, we'll just let him store his stuff here, we'll invite him so he'll stop causing all this ruckus, it'll just be some other thing, because that's kind of how this situation works. And I don't really like calling it like the frog in the pot thing, because I think that that's a misnomer, but it is very much a case of slowly and slowly turning up the pressure. And basically, someone does something, they flip out, they get mad, they cause a whole ruckus, it's very upsetting, and in order to avoid that, the abused person and the people around them are going to try to avoid that, but then something else is going to cause, and then they'll just slowly and slowly and slowly back that person up into a corner. And I expect at some point there will be some escalation. I expect at some point that Sam will demand that Leia break up with Sean. I would expect that, and I would be prepared for that eventuality, but I definitely think that Sean should not ease up on his boundaries around their shared space. It's his home too. He doesn't have to put up with Sam. Another thing that might be helpful, and I don't know if Leia is open to getting counseling on her own, but I would also, if there's a way to do that by maybe Sean and Leia going to see a polyamory-friendly couples therapist, that might be a gateway into her seeing a therapist on her own and realizing that these are really horrible behaviors that Sam is engaging in, that they aren't helping her, that she feels miserable. I think that that is a good gateway. Someone who has the ability to help her objectively see this situation isn't really going to be you, definitely, and isn't really going to be Sean. It's going to have to be a professional, because it's just not something that, and even I wouldn't be surprised as well if Sam said, oh, your therapist hates me, or your therapist, like, criticized her credentials, or her, them, or they, or he. I would not be surprised for a second if Sam does that, but at least getting her onto that kind of a track might help. But ultimately, she has to make that decision. She has to decide that she doesn't want to be with Sam anymore. And the thing of it is that I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it takes people an average of 7 attempts to leave someone who is abusive. I believe that is the average. The average is 7. So it is very, very hard for people who are stuck in this cycle to just break out of it. And as much as it might seem simple to you, because you're seeing it from the position, I think that you get that. I don't think that you think, you're not like most people who are in your situation, or a lot of people that are in your situation, where they would be like, oh, well, she just must want this because she's tolerating it. It's just so much more complicated than that when you're kind of in the middle of it. So, yeah, to sum up, there isn't very much you can do. This does sound pretty abusive. Like, I'm not going to label Sam one way or another, but clearly this isn't a relationship that is really suiting Leia. It doesn't really seem like overall the net benefit of this relationship weighs out all of the drama and difficulty it brings to her life. However, obviously she is the one who's experiencing it, and obviously a lot of people who are this way can make really lovely partners when they're not being terrible. So it's difficult, but it doesn't sound like a good situation that she's in. Unfortunately, there's very, very little that you or Sean can really do about that. I suggest you read Why Does He Do That by Lundy Bancroft. If you can get Leia to read it, that would be really helpful. I honestly read it like just before I was probably going to enter a really shitty relationship. I don't know if he was abusive, but he definitely was, gosh, how do I say it? He was definitely denigrating to me, and I put up with it because I guess I just assumed that I was being sensitive. And I would never put up with that now. But at the time I did, because even if you are a feminist and strong and all this sorts of thing, you're still encouraged by society to think some things about yourself, think some negative things about yourself. And you're also, like I said, he's probably not terrible all the time. So it's very difficult to, when you have someone who's, especially because he has all these interests that, Sean isn't interested in, it's hard to just drop that. It's very hard. But if she can read that book, it might help her out. If you can get her to visit youarenotcrazy.com, that might be helpful. Although don't be like, your boyfriend is a horrible, abusive person. Here's a site that will help convince you of that. I don't know, work it into something else. Maybe if you watch a movie where there is an abusive relationship, mention the site. Like, if there's a way you can get her to visit it without being like, this is what your boyfriend is, that would be helpful. Because any pressure you put on her isn't really going to help the situation. Absolutely remind Sean that he is and should continue to put down firm boundaries around his shared living space. Obviously, he can't tell Leia to not see Sam anymore, but he can absolutely put down boundaries around his shared living space and around what things are, around who's in his house and who he sees, and he should not let up on those boundaries. He should absolutely keep them going and do not give up on them, even if Sam continues to throw a fit and continues to call him names, all this nonsense. And last but not least, if there is some way for Sean to get Leia in with him in some polyamory-friendly couples therapy, that might help her begin some type of internal exploration about this relationship and what it's doing to her. That a therapist is going to be the person who will have the most objectivity, but also be fully prepared for Sam to disregard the therapist, to trash talk the therapist, to encourage Leia not to see the therapist, etc. and so forth, to even see this leap to therapy as another sign that Sean is controlling. So just expect all of that, because that will happen. But yeah, you just got to be there if you can for her. Don't give up on her. Don't allow her to be isolated, because she is going to need, when she finally realizes that this isn't a good situation, if you the entire time have been like, he's bad, then she's going to go, well, I don't want to go to that person who said that, because they're going to say, told you so. Like, if you can be that person that is supportive to her and friendly to her and do the best you can, then that's really, that's going to help her out more in the long run. So I hope that helps, and good luck. Thank you for listening to episode 62 of Non-Monogamy Help. If you want to be awesome, you can donate to our Patreon. Donating $5 or more a month means your name, with your permission, of course, will be read at the end of the podcast. This week's current patrons are
Laura Boylan, Chris Albury-Jones, Juke Ellen Robertson, and James Wartell.
If for whatever reason you can't become a patron because life happens, if you can take 5 minutes and log into iTunes, find the podcast, rate and review it, that would be so amazing. I'd really appreciate it. If you don't want to write a review, it's absolutely fine just to leave a rating. I would appreciate that, because any kind of review helps us get higher a little bit on some of them charts, gets people listening, which hopefully gets more patrons, which hopefully means I could do this as my job. I could take Dan Savage's job, which is what I want to do. Anyway, that's all for this week. You will get a new column next Friday and another podcast in a fortnight even. Thank you again for listening. You've been listening to Non-Monogamy Help. Our podcast music has been provided by Chris Albury-Jones at albury-jones.com, and the art was made by Dom Jung at domduong.com. Thank you for listening.